Hi there, my name is Jenny Feick, and I'd like to welcome you to the first in a series of educational video webinars for the Great Divide Trail Association. And we're starting out with some videos about the natural history of the Great Divide Trail area. The Great Divide Trail Association is committed to reconciliation, which starts by taking this and every opportunity to acknowledge our honor and privilege to live, work, and play within Treaty 7 territory. We honor and acknowledge that the Great Divide Trail passes through traditional Indigenous territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Stoney Nakoda, the Tsuut'ina, the Cree, the Shwe-Wepma, the Clay Dena, Tanaha, Sinixt, and Métis. The Great Divide Trail Association would like to invite you to advocate for what you love and to preserve nature for future generations to enjoy, while educating yourselves and others on Indigenous history and perspectives. This video is the first in a series of natural history-oriented presentations called the Nature of the Great Divide series. This Nature of the Great Divide webinar focuses on the big picture, and that is Great Divide's geography, its ecosystems, its climate, habitats, all the big things. Before I begin tonight's talk, I'll share a bit about my background. I have a Bachelor of Science honors in environmental biology with a minor in physical geography, a master's in environmental science, and a PhD in natural resources geography, all from the University of Calgary. During my 25-year coast-to-coast career with Parks Canada, I worked as a park naturalist in Mount Revelstoke and Glacier, Waterton Lakes, and Kootenay National Parks, and then other positions in Banff National Park and Yoho National Park, the Western Regional Office, and in Atlantic Canada. And from then I moved on to work for the BC government. And from 2000 to 2012, I managed various programs for the BC Provincial Ministry of Environment, including habitat protection, terrestrial ecosystem science, stewardship outreach, climate change adaptation for nature, and environmental policy. And I retired from full-time work with the government in 2012. And then my husband, Ian Hatter, and I now live in Invermere, British Columbia, where we're a little closer to the Great Divide Trail than we were when we lived in Victoria. In terms of my connection with the Great Divide Trail and the Great Divide Trail Association, I was one of the so-called original 6 on Project Great Divide Trail's crew in 1974, who surveyed the route between Waterton Lakes National Park and Banff National Park with the idea of finding a route for the Great Divide Trail. I was one of the founders of the first Great Divide Trail Association, a past board member, and for one term, past president. I have hiked a lot of the Great Divide Trail in sections over the years, although I haven't hiked north of Wilmore Wilderness Park, so I'm looking forward to seeing Kakwa someday. When the GDTA was resurrected in 2013, I rejoined and started volunteering on trail work parties and also writing articles regularly on natural history topics and also Great Divide Trail history topics for the GDTA's Pathfinder newsletter. And lastly, I'm the compiler and editor of both editions of Tales from the Great Divide, vignettes on the origins and early history of Canada's Great Divide Trail and Great Divide Trail Association. This book is a self-published compendium of stories from individuals involved firsthand in the start and development of the GDT and the GDTA. Okay, here's what we will cover in this talk. After a geographical orientation to the Great Divide and a bit on its climate and weather, I'll outline the vegetation zones that creates and then describe in more detail the ecosystems and habitats you will experience as you hike the GDT. I will mention the ecosystem processes you will witness and the ecosystem services that you can appreciate as you are going along the GDT. And I'll wrap up with just a mention of the role of biodiversity and all that. Future natural history webinars will focus on the biological diversity of the Great Divide, its flora and fauna, and other tiny but mighty organisms. The Great Divide is the high elevation divide, continental watershed divide in Western Canada. This height of land divides the waters that flow into the Pacific Ocean from those that flow into the Atlantic via Hudson's Bay. And in Jasper and the Wilmore Wilderness, the waters that flow north into the Arctic Ocean. And if you saw Connor Elzinga's Geology and Glaciology webinar on April 4th, 2024, he had a great map which he showed, which illustrated all of this and how all the different watershed basins work. In 1905, when Alberta became a province, the Canadian government identified the Great Divide as the interprovincial boundary between British Columbia and Alberta from the US boundary at the 49th parallel, all the way up to the the intersection of the Great Divide with the 120th meridian of latitude. And there, the provincial boundary continues straight north, whereas the divide carries on into British Columbia. The Great Divide continues in a northwest direction into British Columbia, as I mentioned, and the crest of the Rocky Mountains trends southeast to northwest, as does the BC-Alberta border in the southern half of those two provinces. The Great Divide Trail traverses the vicinity of the Great Divide for 1,123 kilometers from Waterton Lakes National Park in Alberta in the southeast to the north terminus in Kakwa Provincial Park, British Columbia in the northwest. It crisscrosses the divide numerous times. It is in British Columbia 35% of the time, and in Alberta 65% of the time. The latitude range of the GDT is 5 degrees. So one hikes from the 49th parallel of latitude to the 54th parallel of latitude. And each degree of latitude is approximately 111 kilometers apart. So one hikes 555 kilometers from south to north. The longitude range is 7 meridians. One hikes from the 113 degrees of longitude in Waterton Lakes National Park, Alberta, to 120 degrees of longitude in Kakwa Provincial Park in BC. Since the imaginary lines of longitude, or meridians, converge at the poles and are widest at the equator, the distance between lines of longitude varies with latitude. However, between Waterton and Kakwa, that variation is so slight. So the longitude lines are roughly 73 kilometers. So crossing 7 meridians means hiking 511 kilometers from east to west. Focused on traversing the Rocky Mountains, the GDT varies considerably in altitude. The highest altitude reached along the GDT is 2,590 meters above sea level at an unnamed pass above Michelle Lakes, just south of Alberta's White Goat Wilderness area. The lowest point is 1,055 meters above sea level at Old Fort Point Trailhead near Jasper Town Site. The southern terminus is along Upper Waterton Lake at 1,274 meters above sea level, and the northern terminus is at Kakwa Lake which is 1,471 meters above sea level. And there is a lot of up and down in between. Now, the Great Divide is best known as being, since it is a watershed divide, as being the headwaters of major watersheds. And in fact, the Great Divide is the source of the headwaters of the major rivers of Western Canada. These include places like Elk and Flathead rivers that flow into the Columbia River system that ends up in the Pacific Ocean, and the North Saskatchewan and the Bow rivers, whose waters eventually reach the Atlantic. In addition, it's the source of the Athabasca River that flows north to the Mackenzie River, which eventually drains into the Arctic Ocean. The Athabasca River is the longest river in Alberta, 1,538 kilometers long. The first 168 kilometers of that is located in Jasper National Park and is designated as a Canadian Heritage River. The climate of the Canadian Rockies results from the effects of its location on the North American continent. The Rockies lie inland from the Pacific Ocean, the source of the major storms carrying moisture. They are thus the driest of the three major mountain ranges in the West, the Coast Range being the wettest, the Columbia Mountains in between, and then the Rockies. In the winter, cold air moves down from the Arctic, and in general, as the systems move upslope from the northeast, this produces snow. The Rockies get a lot of snow at their higher elevations, usually, although not as much as the mountain ranges further west. Also, Canada's portion of the Rocky Mountains are all above the 49th parallel of latitude. So generally, as you increase in distance from the equator to the poles, it gets cooler. So higher latitudes are cooler. Different plants and animals live in the south than in the north. And the same is true as one moves up in altitude or elevation. Generally, it is cooler as you go higher with more wind. Sometimes there are inversions where cold air is trapped in the valleys with warm air up top. The Rockies are also prone to cycles of upslope and downslope winds. The mountains block the major weather systems from the west, forcing the air to rise upslope in a process called orographic lifting. Downslope winds occur when warm, dry air descends rapidly down a mountain slope. These so-called Chinook winds are common on the east side of the Rockies. These winds can blow over 64 kilometers per hour and can occur in sudden gusts that are even stronger. As they move down the mountainside, they warm the environment, hence their name in Blackfoot, the snow eater. Along the GDT, the weather can change in an instant as the winds go over the crest of the continent. Not only does this affect hikers, but who need to be prepared for rapid changes in temperature and precipitation, but this affects the plants and animals that live near the Great Divide. Local terrain in the Rocky Mountains creates microclimates. Even something like slope aspect will affect shade and cooling. This leads to shorter growing seasons and more moisture on north and east facing slopes, and warmer, drier conditions and longer growing seasons on south and west facing slopes. Here's an example from the Boom Lake Trail in Banff National Park, Alberta, which is near the Great Divide, but not part of the GDT route. Here, the north-facing side of the trail still has snow left over from the previous night, but the snow has already melted on the south-facing side. Climate change is already resulting in deviations from the standard patterns of Rocky Mountain weather. There are now and continue to be more avalanches and more extreme weather events. This affects local flora and fauna and is a reminder that hikers always need to be adequately prepared. Glaciers have melted significantly during my lifetime, with the warming average global temperature since the mid-1950s. As glaciers continue to melt, the Great Divide area's glacier-fed streams and rivers will experience higher water levels early in the season throughout July and into August, with implications for river crossings. We are already experiencing a lot more hot, dry days in summer, and a real concern for GDT hikers has become how to prevent heat stroke. Likewise, we have seen more forest fires and a longer forest fire season, resulting in smoke-filled skies and limited views in July and August. Ongoing drought will contribute to lower water levels in late summer. Floral blooms are starting earlier and then drying up by late July. The last few years, there has been an extended fall hiking season. Altitude creates vegetation zones. Different plant species grow at different elevations. It is increasingly difficult for plants to grow the higher up a mountain you go due to the harsher weather conditions. The most species and most lush growth tends to be in the valleys and the lower slopes, creating the montane forest a vegetation zone. Further up, the greater amount of snow in the winter influences what can grow. Generally, conifers with tall spire-like shapes and branches that point down to help shed the snow do the best. There comes a point where there is so much snow, wind, and cold temperatures in winter that very few plant species can grow. This is the alpine zone, the upper mountain slopes beyond where trees can grow. Ecosystems are places where living organisms interact with each other and their surrounding environment. They display a suite of recognizable climatic factors, geological features, and biological organisms. They result from the interplay among the living organisms, the flora, the fauna, fungi, bacteria, etc., and non-living components, climate, geographic position, rocks, topography, and soil of an area. It's really a matter of scale. The entire Rocky Mountains could be considered an ecosystem. A subalpine larch forest can be considered an ecosystem. A small alpine lake could be considered an ecosystem. And even the life supported by a fallen log or an old stump in the montane forest zone could be considered an ecosystem. Ecosystems can be made up of smaller ecosystems and can be large enough to encompass many different habitats. Scientists in British Columbia and Alberta have developed a hierarchical classification system to describe ecosystems at different scales, including those near the Great Divide. And this is just a map of the British Columbia government's biogeoclimatic or BEC zones. A habitat is a place where an organism lives. Along the GDT, you will see a variety of habitats. Terrestrial habitats include different types of forests. Clockwise, from the upper left, there are the lush, low elevation, valley bottom montane forests, such as along Upper Waterton Lake in Alberta. The dense northern coniferous forest north of Jasper National Park in Alberta. The mature subalpine forests, like this one below Fording Pass in Alberta, and the young lodgepole forests regenerating after a forest fire, such as along the Ball Pass Trail in Kootenay National Park, BC. Terrestrial habitats also include forest edges at tree line, the point above which trees cannot grow, as well as areas where human activity or sometimes natural disturbances or even natural features interrupt or prevent tree growth. Counterclockwise from the lower left, you can see former forests that have been logged, like this one north of the Crow's Nest Pass in Alberta, or recently burned, like this one on the Summit Lake Trail in Waterton Lakes National Park, Alberta. Rocky ridge tops near the natural tree line where white bark pine grows, like along the High Rock Trail northwest of the Seven Sisters and Crow's Nest Mountain in Alberta, and subalpine larch forests, also near tree line, along the Rockwall Trail in Kootenay National Park, British Columbia. At or above tree line at high elevations, some tree species persist in a bonsai form known as Krummholz, German for crooked wood. These trees can be hundreds of years old, even though they are very short. They have strong, extensive root systems and are dense and bushy, with a low profile in response to the intense, bitter winds and the short growing season high in the alpine. There are also terrestrial alpine habitats up above where the trees grow. These include, counterclockwise from the upper left, high alpine floral meadows, such as along the Skyline Trail in Jasper National Park, Alberta. Bumpy meadows, which are a type of permafrost formation. These were in the North Kananaskis Pass, Alberta. Wet alpine willow thickets in the Tonquin Valley in Jasper National Park, Alberta. And high elevation wet sedge and willow meadows in Elk Lakes Provincial Park, British Columbia. Terrestrial alpine habitats along the GDT in section G reflect not only their high altitude, but also their high latitude. Being further north, the growing season is even shorter, and there are extensive areas where the GDT traverses high alpine tundra and ridges. While the views are great, the GDT in this area is not always obvious and requires route finding skills and more reliance on the GDT app. Terrestrial alpine habitats along the GDT also include special features. Clockwise from the upper left, there are vertical meadows on avalanche slopes where snow slides have removed the trees, like this one along the Flow Lake Trail in Kootenay National Park, British Columbia, and rock slides such as this one along the GDT in the Blaeberry Valley, BC, which also result in the temporary elimination and suppression of tree growth. Other habitats that pose challenges for plant life include these high, dry alpine ridges, such as Lynham Ridge in Waterton Lakes National Park, and karst formations, including caves, found in places like the Andy-Good Plateau, also known as the Shangri-La area, south of the Crow's Nest Pass in Alberta. There are also aquatic habitats along the GDT, including flowing water habitats, rivers and streams, and water bodies, lakes and ponds. Clockwise from the upper left are spring-fed streams like the Upper Oldman River in Alberta, and glacial torrents, such as the Blaeberry River in BC. Huge mountain valley lakes, such as Upper Waterton Lake in Alberta, and smaller alpine tarns like Cerulean Lake in Mount Assiniboine Provincial Park in BC. There's a lot going on in the ecosystems through which the GDT passes. Ecosystem processes are the physical, chemical, and biological processes that link organisms and their environment. These include biogeochemical and nutrient cycling, energy flow, food web dynamics, and the cycling of water among the atmosphere, water bodies, water courses, and groundwater. A framework for expressing the usefulness of ecosystem processes is through the concept of ecosystem services, which describe ecosystem functions and processes in terms of the benefits to people. They illustrate the link between, on the one hand, the interactions of species with each other and with the physical environment, and on the other, the well-being of people, whether in terms of wealth, nutrition, or security. The 2005 Millennium Ecosystem Assessment divided ecosystem services into 4 categories: those that support the healthy functioning of ecosystems, those that regulate ecosystems and global climate, those that provide beneficial goods that can be profitably used by people, and those that intangibly benefit human culture. One of the most important ecosystem services in evidence along the GDT is the provision of water quality and quantity. Glaciers and snow contribute to slow release of water in a watershed, leading to the analogy of the Rocky Mountains being the water towers of Western Canada. On the left, you can see the Mummery Glacier. Its meltwater goes into the Blaeberry River, which flows into the Columbia River, which flows to the Pacific Ocean. At the right top, you can see North Kananaskis Pass and the Beatty Glacier from the Alberta side. And then at the bottom right, there's a GDTA volunteer getting water from the headwater stream that flows into Dutch Creek in the Oldman River watershed in Alberta. Another vital provisioning ecosystem service is the contribution of the area to maintaining good air quality. Plants take in carbon dioxide, sunlight, and water, and through the process of photosynthesis, make carbohydrates and breathe out oxygen through their leaves as a byproduct. The needle-like leaves of coniferous trees produce and exude a variety of airborne essential oils called phytoncides that protect them from bacteria, insects, and fungi. Exposure to these compounds also enhances the immune function in human beings. Inhaling the phytoncides found in coniferous forests helps to calm our nervous systems, reducing both psychological and physiological stresses. Evergreen conifers, including pine, cedar, spruce, and fir, produce the most phytoncides. So walking through the subalpine and montane forests that flank the GDT offers immense health benefits. Trees really are worth hugging. We hear a lot these days about the importance of carbon storage in mitigating climate change caused by increased carbon dioxide levels in our atmosphere. Carbon is naturally stored in the Rocky Mountains in the following major sinks: as organic molecules in living and dead organisms, particularly trees, as organic matter in soils, and underground in what's called the lithosphere as fossil fuels, such as coal, and in sedimentary rock deposits such as limestone, dolomite, and chalk. Other ecosystem services that vegetation can provide includes stabilizing soils, which helps regulate and protect us from natural hazards such as landslides on steep slopes, and temperature regulation of streams and landscapes. The development of soils is another ecosystem service. Soils result from a combination of the weathering of parent materials, the bedrock and glacial deposits that Connor had talked about on April 4th, and along with erosion, moisture, and decomposition of living things to add organic material. Knowing something about soils and drainage is essential to good trail planning, building, and maintenance, and something that the GDTA takes very seriously. One place where it is not good to build a trail is the valley bottom where there are clay soils. And we can use plants as clues to inform us about where the soils are not ideal for trail development and maintenance. If we avoid the areas with dense willows, sedges, orchids, monkey flowers, butterworts, and other species that need to live in wet areas, we will reduce the cost of trail building and maintenance and reduce the frustration of hikers. Wet clay soils in valley bottoms, that's where not to build a trail. Another vital ecosystem service is the act of pollination. Bees are important pollinators, but not all pollinators are bees. While hiking the GDT, you will probably see pollination in action, thanks to a variety of pollinators. Clockwise from the upper left is a common drone fly along the GDT between Flow Lake and Numa Pass in BC. A white-shouldered bumblebee by Upper Waterton Lake in Alberta. A yellow velvet beetle along the GDT north of Coleman. And a Mormon fritillary on an aster in the Takara Meadows along the Skyline Trail in Jasper National Park, Alberta. The last ecosystem service I'll mention is the aesthetic value we derive from being in nature. Traveling the GDT takes you through a bucket list of spectacular places in the Rocky Mountains. Clockwise from the top left, we have the Carthew Lakes in Waterton Lakes National Park, Alberta, Mount Assiniboine in Mount Assiniboine Provincial Park, BC, Flow Lake from Numa Pass in Kootenay National Park, BC, and Mount Robson in Mount Robson Provincial Park, British Columbia. Biological diversity, the diversity of life on Earth, is not regarded as an ecosystem service in itself, but rather as a prerequisite underpinning all ecosystem services. And the various aspects of biodiversity will be the topics of future GDTA educational videos. To wrap up the webinar, I will share a few thoughts on what we can all do to appreciate and safeguard nature on the Great Divide. There are many excellent field guides that you can use to learn about and identify the flora and fauna and other life of the Canadian Rockies. Due to the weight of the field guides, it's probably best to carry them just on short day trips and use them to build up your knowledge before you go out on a section hike or through hike. Probably the one most relevant to what we talked about today is Ben Gadd's Handbook of the Canadian Rockies. And I should have mentioned also, there's a number of great apps that you can use. They're getting better and better. Merlin is exceptionally good for bird calls, and of course there's Seek and iNaturalist, which are great for identifying plants and other things. And I'd encourage you definitely to join iNaturalist and record your observations on it, because it adds to the knowledge about nature along the Great Divide. One of the most important things you can do as a GDT hiker is to help safeguard nature during your trip by adhering to no trace principles. Just type in no trace backcountry principles in your browser and read the material under each of the 7 principles before you go. Tragically, aquatic ecosystems in Yoho, Kootenay, Banff, and Waterton Lakes National Parks have been contaminated by a tiny parasite from Europe, and it is killing the fish in the lakes and streams. The parasite hitches a ride on fishing gear, all types of watercraft, on the soles of boots, and even in the tiny crevices of skin on our feet. I'll explain more about this parasite in the Tiny But Mighty Organisms video, but I wanted to let you know about the new prohibitions, because in the fall of 2023, Parks Canada introduced a series of measures to try to slow or prevent the spread of whirling disease, which is caused by this parasite I was mentioning in the mountain national parks. These include prohibiting fishing, swimming, diving, or wading, or using any kind of a watercraft in any park waters. In the summer, people cannot hike, walk, or cycle within 3 meters of any water course or water body unless that is on an approved trail, bridge, or ford. One can collect treatable water for drinking purposes. And it's good to know that all the efforts and investments that the Great Divide Trail Association and government land management agencies have made in recent years to build bridges over watercourses along the GDT will help people prevent the spread of whirling disease. That concludes the talk on the big picture aspects of the nature of the Great Divide, its geographic position, its climate and weather, vegetation zones, ecosystems, habitats, ecosystem processes, and ecosystem services. I hope you can tune in to the next session, which focuses on the tiny but mighty elements of biodiversity along the Great Divide, many of which have a huge effect on not just the ecosystem, but you as a GDT hiker. If you have any questions after listening to this video, please put them in the YouTube comments along with your contact information. And I hope you can join me for the next video in this series on tiny but mighty organisms. Take care.